I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
Hey, T-Dog. What is up in his house?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My life is a living hell.
There's just so much beauty in the world, you know?
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
The God you believe in is not only not good, that God made a world filled with liberals.
Curse of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
Perhaps I am cringe, but that makes me free.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
Hell is actually real, and Christianity was right all along. Sorry.
Oh.
The cities are decaying, destroyed by decades of leftist policies. Return to monkey.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This week we are joined by Stephen Michael Davis, I guess our resident representative of the military-industrial complex, and a libertarian YouTuber whose profile has grown rather significantly since the last time I had him on. How's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you, Tyler?
Well, like I said off camera, I'm still coming off COVID, but doing pretty good myself. Or as good as two guys who are living in the periphery of a World War III can possibly be said to be doing. But I guess that's one of the weird things about the times we live in, where a war can be happening right now across the world, and 99% of humanity is just going about their lives tweeting, which
for sure We're careening towards World War III with smiles on our faces, aren't we?
Well, I guess it's probably the better way to go out. Just completely oblivious. Maybe that's not the best way to die or the most honorable way to die, but I don't think I want to see my death coming. So it's like the train you don't see coming that kills you.
It's how I've lived my entire life at this point. I may as well go out like that too. So.
So you wanted to talk about the war in Ukraine, but I was curious as to what's been on your mind with that, because I know you've been kind of picking. You've done videos on Russian diplomacy a long time before the war actually happened.
Yeah.
But what are your general thoughts at the moment? Because it seems like I haven't done anything on Ukraine yet, but at the moment it feels like we're in a really weird spot where everything's kind of just bogged down indefinitely, when we don't really seem to be moving any forward in any serious direction.
So I'm reading a lot on this, and I'm writing a lot on this. Like you said, this was Russia and sort of NATO and all that fun stuff was a topic of interest to me before this conflict happened. I have a few videos talking about it. We'll publish a few going forward too. I don't have a whole lot to say as far as, the tactics and the strategy and what's happening on the ground goes. It's hard enough just knowing what's good information, let alone having anything insightful to say about it, which I certainly don't. But kind of the surrounding discussion about it when I go on Twitter, it really gets me going if I see I had to unfollow Michael Tracy because of all the stupid takes I see from him. I think there is a level of, how do I say this? I think if you looked at what was happening in Ukraine and Russia's invasion, if you just looked at it on paper and didn't name the countries and didn't see any of the stupid commentary on Twitter, it would be very clear who was in the right and who was in the wrong. But you get all obviously our politics are so tribal as is, and then you get people who are just reflexive contrarians, and they see all sorts of rah-rah Ukraine and people posting Ukrainian flags on their Twitter account, and they just have to introduce faux nuance into it, and they have to play the contrarian and say oh, maybe Ukraine aren't these perfectly sympathetic plaintiffs, as if anyone was saying that. I think, I don't know. I think you can edit this part out, by the way.
Well, I think it's fair to say that there's nuances that can be explored and discussed, but it's not within regards to the actual nuance of who's right in the war. I mean, Ukraine itself, it seems, if depending on the degree to which you believe everything from the Hunter Biden laptop story to the the biolab thing and all the Ukraine corruption stuff. Like there's a case to be made that Ukraine has a really iffy relationship with the state, but that's not pertinent to the discussion of who's right in a situation where a foreign power just straight up decides to invade them and just turn them into basically just wants to turn them into a puppet state. That's not the same moral argument.
And let me be very clear. I'm not saying that, well, we know who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, and therefore that gives us clear answers on what to do. It doesn't. You can still recognize that Russia's at fault here and say that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be sending all these weapons. Hey, maybe we shouldn't be deploying troops in Poland and all that stuff. You probably know where I stand on that. I'm generally in favor of arming Ukrainians and sanctioning the Russians. I believe that if Russia isn't sufficiently bloodied by this conflict, they'll just do it again at some other point. Obviously, I think as long as the Ukrainians are willing to fight, we should be willing to help them. If they want to broker a peace deal, we should help them in that regard too. The ball is in their court as far as I'm concerned. We should be helping them out.
What do you think the direction at the moment is, though? I mean, obviously, like you said, the fog of war seems to be, the fog of war dropped the moment the war started, where it wasn't even clear, when the invasion was going to happen. Then it happened. Then it seemed like it was completely hopeless. Then it seemed like Kiev was going to be overtaken within a day. And now we're like 6 weeks into it, and Kiev seems to still be in Ukrainian hands. And I guess Ukraine keeps bragging that it has all these insane wins, but it's not clear if they're getting the wins, because the Ukrainian government seems to be bragging up stories that seem nice and true, but they're more so just kind of morale boosting stories, like the Snake Island thing. Like what do you think the prospects are at this point in terms of the overall direction of the war? Because it doesn't seem like Russia's ability to actually win the war is copacetic at this point.
So, yeah, like you said, obviously Ukrainian propaganda is going strong on Twitter and everywhere else. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is so much contrarian resistance to going rah-rah Ukraine, because the government itself is engaged in that. As far as I can tell, they've pushed the Russians out of their out of Kiev, and now primarily Russia's focused on the east. It's entirely possible that they ended some stalemate like that. I know that Russia is very much willing to throw lots and lots of casualties at a conflict. Excuse me. I guess we'll see the extent to which they're willing to continue to do that, but it could be in for a long slog.
It could be, yeah. I'm curious to the degree that the oligarchs are actually willing to put up with this in the long run, because it seems like they're putting out a lot of time and money. I mean, just disregarding the lives, because it seems like Russia is just willing to throw endless amounts of dead people at things, which that's just been their military strategy since Napoleon. It's throw people at problems until the problem goes away.
Yeah,
but it doesn't seem. I'm curious at what point, this actually starts taking out money from the oligarchs, because that's the moment when the war ends. It's when this stops being a profitable venture.
So I've been reading on this conflict, like I said, and one of the books I've been reading talks about the difference between Ukraine and Russia, and how Russia post Cold War really focused on strengthening the state, and that Ukraine didn't. And one of the things that Vladimir Putin did when he took power was he really consolidated the oligarchs to support him, whereas Ukrainian oligarchy is kind of diverse. Like, that's one of the reasons why they can't have a strong state, is because the people who kind of control different sectors of the economy and the government are not on the same page, whereas Vladimir Putin has kind of gotten all of his ducks in a row at that point. So given that knowledge, and I've just started reading this book, so I couldn't tell you specifics on that, but if that is true, then it's going to be hard to believe that the oligarchs are going to turn on him at some point. I guess you never know, because he loses one, he could lose all of them for all I know, but thus far he seems to have shored up his base of power. So again, we could be looking at a long slog here.
It sounds like his military is not doing as well as that it was projected that you know, it would be. Russia's always kind of had the reputation of being the second largest military on the planet, but it seems like they're bogged down in a way that's very unusual for a first-rate military to be bogged down. I mean, obviously, it's not clear to degree why that is, but I've heard different theories from the idea that the Russian military is just completely filled with corruption, to the idea that the Ukrainians are fighting a 21st century war and the Russians are fighting a 20th century war, and it's not clear exactly what the, you know, where the battle lines are in terms of military strength, because it seems like in a lot of ways Ukraine has a lot of weird, you know, tactical advantages that Russia doesn't seem to be able to take advantage or you know, curb effectively.
Yeah, so one of the ways that the Russian government has been described is as a mafia state. And if we're to take that, you know, analogy seriously, mob bosses, crime syndicate captains usually surround themselves with people who are loyal to them, not necessarily those who are competent, which makes sense from, you know, a standpoint of their survival. But if that's true that Vladimir Putin's done that, and there have been reports that he's done that in the military, that might explain why they haven't performed as well as you think they should have. There's also something to be said for morale. You know, they basically have forced conscription in Russia. A lot of people get out of it with health exemptions, but those are the people who have money and whatnot. But yeah, basically, like, the army's a meat grinder, and most young men of a certain age have to go into it, and it's brutal there. And presumably they were told that this was going to be a short and quick war in Ukraine. There are a lot of reports that that's what Russia thought, and it's been a very difficult time for them and a lot of casualties. You know, morale must be pretty low for them, you assume, and that certainly is a component.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good visualization for how large Ukraine is as a country, but I would imagine, you know, most of them probably thought they were going to blitzkrieg across the entire country, like, overnight in armored vehicles and just have the entire country conquered, but it's amazing just how that much that hasn't happened. Like, I'm not sure if that's just because the Ukrainian army just is really good at its job and is just doing a really good job bogging things down, or if the, you know, all the weapons that are being shipped into Ukraine are actually making a rather significant difference. I obviously a lot of this is stuff that's going to have to kind of come out in the coming months and years after the war, because it's not a lot, because it's not clear what the actual, you know, flow of the combat's like. But I don't know, like, what do you think the immediate flow of the war is going to look like in the coming weeks and months? I mean, obviously, it's hard to guess, but what are you thinking?
As far as from what I've heard, as far as the weapons comments you made earlier, apparently the Turkish drones they've received have been extremely effective in blowing up Russian armor. So that's pretty significant right there. As far as the flow of the war goes, again, I don't know. You heard about the Sunken Battleship, right?
I was gonna bring that up because I didn't hear exact what the circumstances of the sinking were, just that a cruiser went down.
Yeah, so there are rumors that there were 2 nuclear warheads on it, which would be kind of terrifying that fell. But yeah, it's U.S. intelligence says that it was shot down by Ukrainian missiles. So if they can do that, then they can presumably blow up other warships, and, you know, battleships are extremely expensive, and that's very costly. Basically, from what I've heard of people who know this much better than I do, like Michael Weiss, he said that if they can really take out significant portions of the Russian Navy, then taking back Crimea is on the table, which, you know, I feel like Russia would really come to the table more so if they thought that was a realistic possibility. It was very important to them to gain Crimea back, because, you know, that's where their only warm water port. So it's hard to believe that they would, you know, they would want to cut their losses before they lost that. That's what I think, but who knows?
I'm curious if Russia has any sort of air supremacy over the Ukraine at the moment, because it doesn't seem like they have actually managed to get that. I mean, obviously there's stuff like the Ghost of Ukraine rumor, but
Ghost of Kiev.
Oh yeah, the Ghost of Kiev. Yeah. What? How do I don't know how you can run a war in the 21st century without actually gaining air supremacy over your opponent. I mean, you'd think that the first thing Russia would do would be to strike all of Ukraine's airfields and keep anything from lifting off, but they haven't seemingly done that. If Ukraine's still capable of launching both anti-air missiles and aircraft capable of taking out a naval cruiser, that's a rather significant oversight.
Yeah, as far as why they haven't taken air supremacy, I don't know. I know one of the things that Russia has done is they've been bombing a lot of Ukrainian weapons manufacturing facilities, and the idea behind that is disarming Ukraine, basically eliminating their industrial capacity to create weapons. But obviously, for the time being, if there's just getting tons of weapons from the West, that doesn't really matter. But if Russia brokers a deal wherein Ukraine has to disarm, where they can't produce weapons and they can't get weapons from the West, that would potentially, down the road, that would make them vulnerable to, again, another Russian attack of a different kind. As far as why they haven't established air supremacy in this conflict, I don't know. You'd think they would be able to, but then again...
maybe the shocking answer is just that they aren't able to. Like, maybe this is back to the utter incompetence angle, where obviously that's speculation, but maybe it's very possible that the Russian Air Force is just completely decrepit at this point. Like, or it's being managed in such a way where they're not prioritizing air supremacy, which, anyone who's ever seen any footage about the Gulf War knows that that's exactly what you do if you want to win a war. You take over, you have to have air supremacy. That's the beginning and end of conflict right there.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, I don't know. I'm more interested in the diplomatic situation around it. It sounds like Ukraine joining NATO is, first of all, that was never that realistic of a possibility, especially after 2014. But it definitely sounds like that's off the table. They still might be able to join the EU. I know that there's been a big push in the country to join these Western democratic institutions, and that's one of the reasons why Russia's been so aggressive, is because they don't want to lose the countries that are in their orbit to those institutions. But hopefully when the conflict is over, that they are given at least some sort of assurances as far as their defense goes. And then again, they were supposed to have those after they gave up their nuclear arsenal, so I guess we'll see.
Yeah, can you go a little into your... You'd spoken previously about the Russia's military interests, about building its borders up and creating buffer zones. Can you go into a little about how that might have played a role in their motivations for the conflict?
So traditionally, Russia is a land power. Obviously they got pretty big. They reach all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the theory on land powers is they're traditionally insecure, meaning they kind of have to keep pushing out until they they feel safe. And their Moscow, their capital, is pretty vulnerable, no natural defenses. So that's the theory, is that those are the seeds of Russian expansionism. And traditionally, Russia has meddled with its neighbors. And part of that's because, back when they were the Russian Empire, they did that. And then the Soviet Union did that with the Warsaw Pact states. And now they're doing that under this sort of Eurasian mentality. They view Belarus and Ukraine as their fellow Slavic nations that are essentially extensions of Mother Russia. But they also view what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Caucasus to their south, as their direct security interest. And if they can't effectively control these nations by proxy, then they're vulnerable. So when they see, after the Cold War, nations like Poland, like Hungary, like the Czech Republic and such, as well as the Baltic states, moving in a more democratic direction, joining NATO, they see that as a threat to them. Now, This is when people like Glenn Greenwald and Michael Tracy will come in and be like, well, see, they shouldn't have joined NATO because that was going to piss them off. It's like, okay, and now we're in the land of counterfactual. If NATO didn't expand and we didn't make overtures to these nations, first of all, they wanted to join us. It's worth noting that's always left out. But if that wasn't done, what would the world be like? Now, I think in that world, Russia is aggressive towards its neighbors, and there's even more theaters of conflict. Because if these nations are going to resist, which most of them will, then you have even more Ukraines on your hands. The fact that they're in NATO, the Baltic states, Poland, all the rest, means that Russia is very unlikely to meddle with them because they know that's going to get them potentially in a direct military conflict with the United States as well as every other NATO country.
You're probably right, but I do think that there is something to be said for Ukraine joining NATO. Probably would have been, it probably would have freaked out Russia a lot had they actually done that before now. Like, I don't think it wouldn't have... Obviously, there's a fair case to be made that Ukraine needs to find some way to, convince Russia that it shouldn't invade it, or at least in an ideal world, there should have been some way that they could have maintained some level of diplomacy between the two countries.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that there was a feasible way that, Ukraine joins NATO, or any way that now, especially after the invasion, that NATO can help Ukraine, that doesn't just immediately set off World War III. Because, I mean, right. Russia being what it is extremely reactionary, and it's going to, respond with irrational means if it has the ability to.
Sure, and a lot of Ukrainian, geopolitical expert types would say that the error they made was in 1994 when they gave up their strategic nuclear weapons, which was originally a Russian stockpile that had been stationed there. When they gave that up for security assurances from the United States and Russia, but obviously, they didn't think the United States was going to invade them anytime. So the ones on behalf of the United States were the ones that mattered, and obviously we didn't live up to those. So a lot of people will point to that and say, well, that was the original sin. That's because you had Russia looming over them. A lot of hardliners from Russia essentially view Ukraine as theirs, and they never accepted that they were separate. But that was their chance to get some real security assurances, and they didn't. Or better yet, in some people's opinions, not give up the nuclear weapons because, if you have nuclear weapons, people are a lot less likely to invade you. But yeah, Ukraine is very much, some people would call it a fake country. That's kind of nonsense. I don't know what they define as a real country, but it's definitely a country that's very much split along the lines of East-West. And so it was always going, there really is a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in the eastern parts of the country. And so that's always been a difficult line to straddle for them to straddle. So it was never going to be a clear cut, they're never going to go clearly in one direction or the other. So maybe this partitioning of the country was inevitable, and maybe we will see that. And maybe in the long term, that will lead to a more peaceful coexistence between the nations, but I guess we'll see.
Well, I know that there was like an either ongoing civil war or ongoing violent conflict between the eastern and western states of Ukraine up to the war. Was that an active war that was still happening? Because that hasn't been as talked about as some of the other aspects of it. But obviously there were all these like massive pro-Russia groups in the eastern provinces that were trying to either, get their independence and join Russia or get the whole country to join Russia.
Yeah, so what happened in 2014 was that Russia took over Crimea, they took over Kharkiv, they took over the Donbass, or no, they didn't, excuse me, they basically fomented rebellion in the Donbass and the other, starts with an L, hard to pronounce. But like I said, there is pro-Russian sentiment there. the Ukrainian army was able to take back Kharkiv within a matter of days. They obviously didn't take back Crimea, but then they surrounded these forces in the Donbass and the other one, and that's when Russia actually got its own soldiers involved. And the actual hot war that was happening there ended within a few months, but there has been effectively civil war between the pro-Russian separatists and the pro-Ukrainians in those parts of the country. I'm sure, like any other conflict, it has its ebbs and flows, but obviously that came to a head earlier this year when Russia actually invaded, citing those conflicts as part of their pretense.
Yeah, I mean, their whole I seem to recall their entire excuse was denazification, which was
that was certainly part of the story.
I mean,
that's pretty limp-wristed. That's pretty weak tea, if you ask me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, of all the excuses I've heard for starting a war, I mean, I could believe some Western social justice warrior might make that excuse for starting a war, but I Putin of all people, I mean,
yeah,
I get that the guy was a KGB agent, and being part of that agency means you probably have some spicy opinions about the Nazis, but that's such a very thin excuse. I mean, there's all these there's a lot of different stories about the Ukraine's role in the Second World War and how there were certain battalions that were conscripted into the German army and all that kind of stuff. But and plus there's the rumor of that battalion that uses Nazi imagery or something to that end.
Azov battalion.
Yeah, I don't know the full story about how legitimate that is, but it was at the very least it was funny watching the lefty types support that. But it was the irony of supporting the Nazis to fight the Nazis. But beyond the joke level of that, I haven't seen any serious allegations that they were doing anything other than having a weird symbolism.
Right. As far as the Azov battalion goes, to my knowledge, part of it is far right neo-Nazi types, I guess. Probably not the nicest guys in the world, probably not the type of guys you and I would like to get along with. Maybe so. The reason why they did this, one of the reasons why they did this whole denazification thing is because that rhetoric really plays in Russia. Obviously, Russia was betrayed and invaded by the Nazi Germany in World War II, and millions of people died. And so, that memory looms large, and they really are hardliners against the Nazis, at least in rhetoric. It's funny because he gives this whole denazification thing, and then Putin gives this big blood and soil speech about how Ukraine is really part of Russia. It's okay, yeah, you're not railing against Jews and you're not trying to elevate the Aryan race, but it's you definitely have some overlapping ideology with them. And it's not like Russia has its hands clean on supporting certain bad actors. They have brought jihadists into this conflict. They brought their own far-right factions into this conflict. So, yeah, I really don't buy that as an excuse, and I think anyone who repeats that is being a useful idiot.
I in terms of overall motivation, do you think that there might be, from what you're reading, do you think there might be greater, attempts to one of the theories I've heard about the entire purpose of the war is that it's an attempt to try to create a bipolar world order, essentially by if Russia can successfully conquer the Ukraine, then they will once again control the breadbasket of Europe. Mm-hmm. And since they're allied with China, and China has its own imperialist ambitions that it's planning to not necessarily impart in the near future, but work on in the next decade or two, that it might create a new world order where Russia and China are essentially just united as a superpower and, cycling their own resources within themselves, while everyone else kind of circles around America sanctioning both countries at the same time, and it kind of forces everyone to pick a side.
Sure. It's hard to say. It's hard to say exactly to what extent Russia is collaborating with China. China has good reasons not to align with Russia, as you know, the United States and other Western nations are much wealthier and better customers of theirs. But it is true. Well, I shouldn't say it is true. Apparently, Vladimir Putin told Xi Jinping at the Winter Olympics that he was planning on invading Ukraine, and Xi Jinping basically signed off on it, but said wait till after the Olympics, because you know he didn't want that to get overshadowed and things to be controversial there. But yeah, apparently they did have China's blessing. Now, as far as Russia's motivations, again, I think they have this idea that if they don't directly control these nations, they're eventually going to lose them to the West. And I think, and apparently, you know, Russian exceptionalism is very strong. They view themselves as needing to be an important nation. And I think having Ukraine is part of being an important nation. So yeah, I think they regret I don't think they necessarily long for the communism of the Soviet Union, but I think they definitely long for being viewed as on par with the United States and as being viewed as a superpower.
That's what I've heard. I mean, I've seen plenty of video essays on this, so you know, I am now an internet expert on these things.
Oh sure, yeah.
As
we all are.
Yeah, I don't know where I get my Twitter diploma as a geopolitical master strategist, but it does seem like that you know, I don't think anyone in Russia is particularly pining for communism, but I definitely think their entire self-identity as a nation is rooted in the idea that they're of an equal status or near status to the United States, and living essentially as a glorified third world nation for the past 40 years has really done bad things to their ego as a nation, and they have all these structural internal problems with their population and declining population, large amounts of older people. It just not good statistics from a long-term solvency standpoint, and I definitely see them, you know, they want to win. They need something to point to as like, this is what we're capable of.
Yeah, I mean, market liberalization didn't work out well for them, and there's a bunch of reasons we could get into and as to why that's the case. I think the liberalization of the Russian economy after communism was just executed so terribly and corruptly that, you know, they have this negative view of free market capitalism that I don't think is warranted, but I get why they're angry about it. But the whole 21st century power thing hasn't worked out for them. So they're going back to the roots to be a 19th century power, which is a military power. And, you know, that's not the world we live in, but I think there are people who want that to be the world that we live in, and they're going to make it so by pretty much, you know, unapologetically invading a neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, Putin's definitely a pre-modern, you know, tyrant in the way he thinks. And I mean, but part of it obviously just comes down to the fact that I don't think their liberalization ever went down in a way that was ever intelligent or, you know, well structured. I mean, famously, I mean, the corruption of 1990s Russia was just over the top. Like, you know, generals selling used military helicopters to like warlords and strangers and like anyone that could you know, afford anything. It's like they're just going to sell off everything because no one cares. The Soviet Union's gone. Everyone's just kind of, you know, done. And if you see any like, you know, firsthand accounts of like major cities in the decade after the war, it's just like, you know, the police are corrupt, taking bribes from everyone. There's just riots in the streets. No one's, you know, all your neighboring countries are in various states of civil war, or they're being taken over by, you know, tin pot dictators. It's not a place conducive for a growing free market to have any sort of you know, solvency or effectiveness, and especially, and you can definitely tell it's really, you know, battered down the working and lower classes in Russia, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with that. I'm glad I don't have to live in a country that's you know, structurally failing and just rotting from the inside out. And because it definitely feels like they're not. It's not really a capitalist society. It's more of a, you know, a glorified corporatist oligarchy, because it's where all the money just seems to go straight to the rich people, which, you know, there's a lot to be said about that, but
yeah, and as you said, there's these massive problems with civil society, the alcoholism, the drug abuse, the decline in demographics, and the fact that any civic institutions are basically squashed under communism. They don't have anything to lean on, really.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to actually see how and when this comes to some sort of a head. Like, I get the feeling that if it's this badly bogged down now, it's probably not going to change for, you know, coming months or weeks. I like, ideally, I think the best way out of this is probably the, you know, the negotiation option, although it would be entertaining to see Ukraine chase them all the way out of the Crimea, if that's possible. But at this point, it'd be very... I don't know if I necessarily believe a full-on counterattack would necessarily work in their favor. I mean, they seem to work better when they're able to just kind of, you know, stand around every corner with an RPG and just take out every armored vehicle that tries to drive through the city.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason, like, the Viet Cong tactics work. It's a lot easier to have like 1,000 RPGs just aimed at one armored vehicle than it is to, you know, run a multi-layered campaign, especially when you don't have air support.
Yeah, the counterinsurgency is very different than actually retaking territory that's been in the enemy's hands for almost a decade now. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see how it ends. I don't know. You want to talk about something more lighthearted?
What's on your mind?
I don't know. I've just been, have you given, what's that game? Elden Ring. Have you played that?
Oh, I'm not good at keeping up with video games anymore, but everyone I know is playing it. Even people that have never touched like any of the games in that, you know, the Dark Souls series or any of that developer's games before. I'm getting like weird messages from people like, you know, friends step bombs on Twitter, and my, you know, people that don't play RPGs being like, "Hey, I'm playing Elden Ring. Are you playing it?" I'm like, it's like, okay, this game is broken out in a weird way. Are you playing it?
Yeah. So okay, you mentioned people who bought the game and had never played Dark Souls before, were completely unfamiliar. That was me. You know, obviously there was a lot of buzz around the game before it happened. And I'm like, oh, an open world game. I was a huge Skyrim fan, huge Oblivion fan. And I'm like, man, you know, I need something to scratch that itch. And Breath of the Wild was great, but I basically played that to death. I need an RPG that's open world and crazy, you know, of a fantasy variety. I'm not opposed to Cyberpunk by any means, but, you know, I don't have the requisite hardware to play at. Apparently Elden Ring. And I'd heard Elden Ring worked well on previous generation consoles. So I bought it, and I'm like, you know, going through the tutorial and everything. And then I finally get out in the world, and people told me this game was hard. And I was like, how hard could it be? I'm dead like 10 times in 10 minutes. That game is fucking impossible. And I played it once for a couple of hours, and I have not gone back to it. So I'm like, this is going to take me so long, and I know my like stubbornness is going to take over. I'm just going to keep playing and playing and playing and playing. It's going to be the biggest time sink, but I will make my way back to it eventually. But man, it's fucking difficult.
Well, the entire Dark Souls ethos is the idea that you throw yourself at the wall so many times that the wall itself just gives away out of pity. So there's a certain flow to it that you have to kind of get yourself in the right headspace to understand. Where you are just like completely in the zone, and your reflexes are working are perfect, and you're just learning the patterns of the boss. And after your third or fourth death, now you know every single one of his attack patterns, and you are in complete control of the situation. And everyone I know who plays those games tends to get really, really invested in them. But yeah, it takes a long time for you to actually kind of break through that wall of, like, you know, understanding the flow of combat and understanding the flow of gameplay for you to really like it, which I guess is why I haven't really gotten that far into it. I played a little bit of the first Dark Souls game back on the 360 just because I wanted to have a taste of it, and I beat through the first boss and then I kind of got, tired of it just because I'm not a difficulty hound, so it wasn't something I felt the need to invest myself in fully. But I'm sure if I really did, just embrace the whole beating my head against a wall thing, I probably would really get into it.
Right. I told you this in DMs, is that I'm playing through all the canon Zelda games, and you told me you were not a big Zelda guy, right?
I haven't beaten any of them. I've played through like one or two of them, but I know a lot about the series because of all my friends who have been really into it.
Sure. I kind of figured you would be, because you're not too much younger than I am, so it's like it should be in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've played 5 now, I think, and I'm on to this Game Boy one, and it's one that should be like, it came out in 2001 when I was 12, so you'd think I would have played this one, but I wouldn't. And I had a Game Boy Color, but I just never played it. It's called Oracle of Seasons, and it's actually pretty good. And it's actually pretty difficult. It's like the overworld. It's not difficult in that, like, the Dark Souls way, and that enemies just keep coming at you and they're gonna kill you. It's difficult in figuring out what to do next, because Zelda games are kind of written like puzzles. You gotta figure out bit by bit. But it is fun.
Plus, a lot of those old original Game Boy games, a lot of what they do is that they would take like the Super Nintendo version of the game, and then they would just break it down. And usually the side effect that has is that the games don't have enough buttons to actually make the combat systems work all that well. Mm-hmm. So I've seen games like the Game Boy Samus, or the Game Boy Metroid, or the Game Boy Link's Awakening, where you have one weapon that's combat, and the other weapon is takes you into a menu that allows you to change out your weapon. So every combat encounter ends up being half the time you're spending in the menu, and then because the game screen is so small, you end up having to consult maps like outside of the game constantly just to understand where you are, because it's very, there isn't the cartridge just didn't have the ability for an in-game map, so it became you're fighting the you're fighting the game and you're fighting the hardware at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I'm playing this on the 3DS version, so it is a little. You can actually like look at a map and it's comprehensible. But yeah, definitely. There's only 2 buttons, A and B, as well as obviously the motion pad. So you're constantly going into the menu and bringing out new items and stuff like that. But other than that, it's a pretty good game. If anybody who's listening to this likes sort of top-down Zelda games, it's a quality one.
What are the other ones you've played at this point?
Okay, so it started with Skyward Sword, which I played that for the Switch. I heard the controls were not good for it. I'll just say that much. I heard that they were even worse for the Wii U, but they were pretty bad for the Switch, which is too bad, because other than that, it's a great game. Then what was next? After that was Minish Cap, which was on the Game Boy Advance. That was okay. It's another overworld Zelda game. As far as those go, it was not bad. After that was Four Swords Adventures, which was dumb and bad. After that was Ocarina of Time, which is probably my favorite Zelda game, and that was fantastic. Even though I played it before, then this playthrough was fun. Then Link to the Past was next, and I love that game as well. And that I beat it in like 4 hours because I've played it 100 times. And now I'm on to this Oracle of Seasons, so I'm making my way through.
I played through the first half of Oracle of Time, and I liked a lot what I played, but I don't quite have the puzzle solving brain where I can just stare at something and just work and reason my way through it anymore. So I think I got to the first temple as adult Link, and I got I just ended up wandering around it like 20 times, and I got stuck at some point, and I never I never ended up getting back into it. Like at some point I want to beat it because I liked the game I played, up until that point, and I just I hit a knot, and then I just never worked through it. And it wasn't even the water temple. It was like it was the forest temple. So I'm like, this game's reputation precedes it. if I'm having trouble in the Forest Temple, I'm gonna have more trouble in the Water Temple when at that point.
Okay, Forest Temple was low key hard on the when I was playing. I'm a stubborn son of a bitch. Like if I look up something online, I consider that like may as well have not played it at all, because like part of it playing it is figuring things out. And so yeah, I literally spent like hours just kind of roaming through the dungeon trying to figure out what to do. By the way, do you have a Nintendo Switch?
I do, yeah.
Okay. If you do happen to go back to that game, I don't know if you bought that or if you've looked into that N64 bundle on Nintendo Switch.
I've heard bad things about it, so I never bothered to get the bundle. But I have my copy of Oracle Time is for the 3DS.
Okay. If anybody listening is looking into buying that, make sure that you get a controller other than the default Switch one that's geared for N64, because it does not work well for like certain parts of it. So I think they have N64 adaptive controllers for the Nintendo Switch. Get one of those, or buy an adapter that allows you to hook up a classic N64 controller, because the Switch controller does not work well for it.
I heard they use like some weird emulator version of the game. Like, is that true, or is it just poorly mapped to the Switch controllers?
It looks fine as far as the port goes. It's so on the N64 they're the C buttons. Those are very important in Ocarina of Time. It's like the right joystick on the Switch controller, and that just doesn't work. Like, they really need to fix that somehow, or like I said, buy a different controller. It's worth it.
Jeez. I got the Mario 3D collection because I wanted to play Sunshine again.
Yeah.
And that was a really weird experience. I never ended up getting that far into it, just because the way they mapped the controllers made it so you couldn't use any of the the exploits that the GameCube controller was capable of.
Okay.
I might have to try playing it with because I have the GameCube controller nozzle for Smash Brothers. I'm curious if that would map onto it better. But I remember playing it with the Switch handheld controller and just being like, I can't do any of the the movements that the GameCube controller let me do. Like, it was weird. Like, it was like playing with one hand tied behind my back. Bad.
Huh. Yeah, that's kind of what this was like. So I don't know. I like the Switch. I think it's a good system, but that's definitely something they have to work out.
Yeah, the games that are designed for it are really well designed for it, but I haven't played any of that many of their ports other than like the 2D ones, and those have been pretty rough.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I know Nintendo's real stingy about like the intellectual property rights over their old games, but it's like, okay, that's fine. You want me to play it on this system? Well, at least do it right. Come on.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, piracy is bad and all that, but most of their games aren't actually available anymore. And now they're shutting down the Wii U market. Like, half of their games are going to be, sitting in a bin somewhere and not completely inaccessible to everyone who didn't buy them prior to that point. So I'm like, what do you want to do? I mean, I guess you go back and buy cartridges of old games that can run upwards of like $500 nowadays.
Yeah, they can get pretty pricey. And they, if you play them on the old system, you can wear the old system out. Those things, they're kind of chintzy now. They were made in the early 90s. And they're collectibles, so
yeah,
I don't know.
I last time I touched my N64, it was crashing during Mario Kart, so I don't think that's a good sign.
Well, and like the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the N64, and even the GameCube to a great extent, those were made for tube TVs. And so, like, you can buy adapters for them. Third-party adapters are not great.
They look so bad, though.
Yeah. It's really hard to get those things that were made on the tube TVs to work on a high-definition TV. I don't know. I liked the NES Classic and the SNES Classic. But again, like you said, there's not enough games on them. I think there's 30 a pop. And it's just like, they look good. They play well because they got the controls down. But yeah, I think they really need to broaden their selection.
I do think that there's something to the SNES Classic, especially since they put a lot of really interesting games on there that weren't, publicly available up until that point. That's where they were just like Earthbound and Star Fox 2.
Yeah. Yeah, because Earthbound, if you want to buy a hard copy of that, it's like $500 or something like that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's insane. At some point, I think they're supposed to like people have been saying that they might like release some of the other Earthbound games. I keep hearing them come up lately. I could be wrong, but I keep hearing people talk about Mother 1 and 3. So I'm curious if there's actually going to do something with that soon.
Interesting.
It would be nice because it's like you said, so many of those games are sitting in someone's intellectual property well, and they're just going unused because someone doesn't think they're going to sell, so they're like, well, what's the point in releasing them? Like,
sure,
but someone's going to buy them. A lot of those games are someone's favorite game. So.
Yeah. What else is new with you? Anything?
Well, we were talking about video games. I've been playing. I played through all the Metroid games in the past couple, and not last year, but between the time that the remake of Samus Returns came out and when the Metroid Dread came out, I played through all the core ones. So
okay,
that was my big video game splurge for the last couple of years, just because some of those cartridges are hard to find. Like I think the one I got a copy of Metroid Fusion on eBay. And I'm pretty sure it's one of those like recreation ones that some guy makes in their basement. But
there are a lot of those floating around. Yeah.
I mean, if I didn't buy it knowing that was the case, but it worked perfectly, so I can't really complain. And
nice.
I'm glad I did, because it was good playing that game before the new one came out. And holy crap, the new one was insanely hard. Like I don't know if games are just getting more difficult nowadays, because it seems like. Like Doom Eternal was that way, and Halo Infinite was pretty hard, and I don't know what it is with game difficulty just ramping up in recent years, but like that Metroid Dread in particular just broke my hand in a way I was not used to. Like I still haven't beaten the final boss of that game. It is.
Oh really?
Yeah. Well, part of it is that I was stupid and I didn't get all the items beforehand.
Okay.
So, I'm going into the final boss, and I should have like 300 missiles, and I only have like 150, so I ended up having to spend like half the boss fight not using the ice missiles. So I just couldn't whittle them down quite enough, and unfortunately that final stage of the final boss is just him running around the battlefield with a laser gun that's designed to basically kill everything on screen, and I'm like, at some point I just can't navigate in this battlefield and have enough missiles at the same time. Like, and after about 50 attempts, I'm like, okay, I'm not having fun anymore. This game is taking years off my life.
Right.
So at some point, I got to go back into that. Run through the entire game one more time, get every single one of the items up to 100%, and then face the final boss one more time, and hopefully win that time, because I'm so close to actually having beaten all of the core Metroid games.
Right.
Except for that last boss fight, which it was brutal.
I'm the same way. I'm less tolerant of like difficulty than I used to be, and I think that's just growing older and becoming impatient with like the bullshit that video games do put you through. Now I just seem to get irrationally mad at them. Like, why would it be like this? That's so dumb. But yeah, I don't know. You watching anything good these days?
I'm trying to think if there's anything new I've seen television wise. I mean, I'm fairly up to date on like movies, but I haven't seen.
Okay.
But I'm pretty bad with Netflix. I'm pretty bad with like television shows. Like that's something people like give me crap about all the time. Like I remember back in high school, some guy told me to watch Dexter, and I put it on a list, and I every once in a while I check my list, and Dexter is still on the list at this point. So, like,
yeah, there are so many shows now you have to watch, right? And there's like 20 streaming services, and I hardly watch TV anymore, but I do have HBO Max, which again I've been paying for and like hardly using. And I started watching this show called Winning Time, and it's very good. It's about when Jerry Buss bought the Lakers, the Los Angeles Lakers, back in 1979, and I don't know. I love it. I'm a basketball fan. I don't think you have to be a basketball fan to like it though. But if anybody's looking for something good to watch that's funny, but also not like totally lighthearted, I recommend it. And if they have HBO Max, of course.
Okay. I hate to cut us off, but my recorder looks like it's about to die. Do you want to shout out anything real quick before we lose any audio?
No. Just check out my YouTube channel. Gonna post videos soon. I got several written. Once I'm officially over this cold, I'm gonna sit down and record them.
Well, I highly recommend that. You're always welcome to come back on again. It was good to talk to you again.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Sure. Have a good night.
Bye.
The AntiSocial Network is a groupthink productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cali, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.